Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to be with Daniel McAdams again. Welcome, Daniel.
Hi, Jay. Thanks for having me back again.
Always good to talk to you. A very interesting article that came out on the weekend, Financial Times, that made me aware of an event I wasn't even aware of. And this is something called the Valdai International Discussion Club. It takes place, I believe it's an annual event in Russia. But the Financial Times talked about, the headlines are, Putin blasts U.S.-led global order. And the first paragraph reads, Russia's President Vladimir Putin accused the U.S. and its allies of undermining the post-Cold War world order, warning that without efforts to establish a new system of governance, the world could collapse into anarchy and chaos. End of quote. That's from the Financial Times on the weekend.
Yeah.
Perhaps I know that you've commented on it on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Can you give our listeners just a sense of what Mr. Putin's position is and what he talked about at this conference?
Well, I think a couple of the main points, and it was a long speech. I think it was an hour and a half or so. It was a very long speech.
Mm-hmm.
It's unusual to have such an in-depth and detailed speech by a political leader. You know, usually they are sound bites and note cards and teleprompters.
Mm-hmm.
But the pardon me, the Valdai Club is as you point out, is an international discussion club of intellectuals. I think from over 50 countries
mm-hmm.
Participate, and actually it's kind of an honor to be invited and to be included in it, I think, just as some of the others are. But actually, this is interesting that probably not known, but Dr. Paul was actually invited to be one of the speakers this year.
Oh, interesting.
And
but he didn't go, did he?
And unfortunately, it did not work with his schedule. No, it didn't work with his schedule, but but he was invited. You know, these are people who think about geopolitics, who think about the bigger picture, and but yes, President Putin gave I think it was the final speech at the club, and it was a very long and very detailed speech, and much of it was a critique of U.S. foreign policy, and much of it would not be alien to listeners of the Jay Taylor Show who listen to me go on every week, I guess. Not that I'm channeling Putin, but the interesting point that Putin pointed out is, and he didn't use this word, but the concept of blowback.
Mm-hmm.
He said the U.S. uses color revolutions around the world, and it backs very, very dubious organizations that are radical Islamic and neo-Nazi,
mm-hmm.
and to make these revolutions take place. And then he says, "quote, the genie's out of the bottle." So these extremists, once they're encouraged to get these revolutions going, they do terrible things. And he pointed out rightly the U.S. support for the holy warriors, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which gave rise, of course, to Al-Qaeda.
Sure.
And in 9/11. And he also pointed, is objectively true, the same thing has happened in Libya. A secular dictator, but a secular leader, was overthrown by the U.S., and now the place is run by competing gangs of Islamists.
Mm-hmm.
They killed the U.S. ambassador. They have sent many jihadists to Syria, which is another place where the U.S. is supporting extremists.
Yeah.
So he points out that this is a kind of a dangerous thing. The double standards of the U.S. When it comes to things like sovereignty, and which is obviously the case because the U.S. is bombing Syria without regard to its sovereignty. There is no legal basis upon which to bomb Syria. And so it was what I found interesting. The speech was interesting. I encourage people to read it or listen to it because it's very interesting. But what I particularly found interesting is the reaction in the U.S. press. And it's kind of funny because one of the things Putin said is the global control of the media allows the U.S. to sell black for white. And it's interesting, but the U.S. media played right into that in their reaction to the speech. They the Robert Perry and ConsortiumNews.com, which is a great site, points out that the New York Times called it a diatribe and said that he had unleashed his strongest diatribe against with his goal to sell Moscow's view that American meddling has sparked most of the world's recent crises. Well, how is that Moscow's view when it's just simply a statement of fact?
Yeah.
The U.S. did spur on the revolution in Ukraine, the overthrow, the coup d'état in Ukraine this year. It was Victoria Nuland, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, who was recorded discussing in great detail the U.S. plans for the overthrow of the elected government. These are not made-up things.
Yeah.
But the media in the U.S. treats it as made up. If you look at any account in the mainstream media, I think Reuters used the term diatribe.
Yeah.
The Washington Post.
Yeah.
So
well, I guess that's the way the propaganda works, Daniel. We don't want the American people to know. I'm saying the mainstream doesn't want the American people to really focus on the truth because we have another agenda. I mean, so what you do is just simply deny the facts as they exist, and use and resort to name calling.
Exactly, and Robert Perry, going back to what he wrote, this is the exact point that he makes, that he says, quote, "Of course, all the, quote, smart people of official Washington know how to react to such statements from Putin with a snicker and the roll of the eyes."
Right.
And so that's exactly what they do. That's consider that where it's from. But I think it is aggressive U.S. foreign policy that is creating these problems overseas. And if you watch the whole speech, there was a question and answer period where one former U.S. State Department official, she was the Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research, which is actually a bureau that I briefly worked in when I was in grad school. But Toby Gotti, she said, and the America you're describing is unrecognizable to me, which I think is a great clue to the way of thinking of the foreign policy elite in the United States.
Sure.
They simply don't, they have no idea what he's talking about. How could you say that the U.S. is fomenting these coups? It just, it seems like something, I've never heard this before.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, I think it's just denial to a great extent. The Council of Foreign Relations recently, in their monthly publication, are trying to rewrite the history with respect to what the United States did covertly in Iran and elsewhere. Recently, some intellectuals come out and wrote and tried to say that the CIA played no role at all in that overthrow. And I think they're just really trying to downplay our aggressive role around the world in various places. As we've had various people on this radio show talk about that in the past. I mean, it's fact, it's not fiction. But what I think the propaganda is trying to do is turn fact into fiction,
Sure.
and so to keep people interested in or not opposed to the United States and NATO's continued expansionism.
Yes. And, there are a lot of people that would look at our criticism of U.S. foreign policy, and they would say, oh, you just want to blame America first. You want to look for all of the problems in America. But, the truth is, Jay, this is not America. This is a small group of elites who control policy, and we're the real America, the America of me and you and our listeners. We're the ones that are forced to pay for this,
right?
Foreign policy. So it's actually very patriotic and pro-America.
Absolutely.
To point out that our foreign policy is being hijacked by people who do not have our interest at heart.
Right. Until the Constitution of the United States has been null and void and voted on and declared so by the people. But in fact, what's happened is the Constitution of the United States has become almost null and void in many ways, even though it was never voted on. But it's certainly not followed. So that should give our listeners a pretty good sense of what Putin had to say. And again, very interesting. They can find this on the website. I guess they go to the Ron Paul Institute. You have a link there probably that goes to this video.
Yes, I published a short piece over the weekend. Actually, on Friday, I was on RT discussing the speech right after it was given, and in that short blog post, there is a link to watch the speech.
Okay, good.
And it is available to read and to watch as well. So.
Okay, well, just maybe before we conclude our discussion today, if you could give our listeners maybe a quick update, anything new in the Middle East that's really of significance?
Well, I think there are a few things of interest. We're not hearing much about the U.S.'s continued bombing of Iraq and Syria over the past few days because, of course, everyone is terrified that they're catching Ebola. or terrified that the that the authorities in New York and New Jersey are going to confine them against their will.
Yeah.
But in fact, something of significance happened over the weekend, I think, and that is that Turkish President Erdogan, who is, as you know, seems to be more interested in fighting the Kurds than in fighting ISIS, even though he's considered one of our partners in this. He agreed on Friday to allow 1,300 Free Syrian Army fighters to join the Kurds in fighting in Syria.
Yeah.
And what that does, it sounds like they're going to be fighting ISIS, but in fact, the Free Syrian Army is much more interested in overthrowing Assad than they are in fighting ISIS. So they share that in common. And as you know, Turkey has been a main supporter of both ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Free Syrian Army over the past several years.
Huh.
So this signals that that Turkey is now getting more active on the ground, putting fighters in there and looking to overthrow Assad. So it's at least a 3 or 4-sided war that they're in there, and it's just an absolute mess.
So in a way, I mean, this is what the U.S. position has always been against Assad. So this is a sort of a backdoor way of trying to get rid of him.
Exactly, and I think the fight against ISIS has a lot to do with the desire to overthrow Assad, at least as much, in my opinion, as to get rid of ISIS. I think the main goal is to do this year, last year, which is to overthrow the government. And both Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all of these countries are absolutely obsessed with overthrowing Assad. And so ISIS provides a convenient excuse to move military military resources into Syria, to be ultimately used against Assad.
Why are all these governments so opposed to Assad?
He's the last secular Arab leader. He's the last secular Muslim leader in the region. They've knocked off Saddam Hussein. They've knocked off Gaddafi. So
are they? So is the goal here to have all the Middle East turned into some sort of Islamic extremist state?
Well, that certainly is what's happening. I don't know if that's the intentional goal, but it's happened now several times.
So we could have one whole region that's nothing more than just an extremist.
Yes, and the military-industrial complex would love that. Would love nothing more than that.
Because then we could have a really big war.
Yeah, and keep it going, or just keep a nice small war burning, for
constantly.
Years. As you know, former Secretary Panetta said, this is going to be a 30-year war.
Oh, goody.
So,
goody. How many people can we kill for profit?
The other thing about Syria is that the Israeli government has wanted Assad to go for a long time. Assad has been a steadfast supporter of the rights of Palestinians, and it's been kind of a thorn in Israel's side because of that. So I think a lot of the neocons here in the U.S., who, as you know, they always like to follow the right-wing position in Israel, whether or not that's good for Israel. They like to follow that. So I think there is certainly that is a factor as well.
Well, it's a mess, and it just keeps getting messier every time I talk to you, it seems, Daniel. Just maybe a note on the Ukraine. What's the latest there?
Well, they had an election of sorts over the weekend.
An election of sorts.
The eastern part of the country, which is, as you know, is trying to achieve its independence and trying to secede, they did not participate in the elections. The new government is essentially will be formed by the current president's party, which is a relatively new party, President Poroshenko, and of course the party is called the Poroshenko Party. So it's kind of convenient. Nobody will forget what it's called, but essentially it's the party of oligarchs. The extreme right neo-Nazis also will achieve some seats in parliament as well. So you have a country that is literally bankrupt, that needs tens of billions of dollars just to survive. And as winter comes, I've already seen pictures of some villages in Ukraine that will not be getting heat.
Wow!
And, it's already starting to get very cold there. So we could see a serious crisis over the winter.
So if we had allowed and stayed out of the Ukraine, this wouldn't have been a problem, probably.
Well, poverty would have been a problem, and the power of oligarchs is a problem. It's not been dealt with. These are people by the way, who are not capitalists as we understand them. I think people should understand that here in the U.S. They are people who have used their former positions in the nomenclatura, the Communist Party apparatus, to secure ill-gotten gains.
Right.
They're very young people who've been able to steal, all of the nickel supply, all of the what have you supply, and become multi-billionaires. So being critical of oligarchs is not being critical of what you and I understand as free market activity, because
Sure.
this is not free market activity.
Sure.
But Ukraine did have a deal with Russia. That was the trigger for the coup. But that deal would have involved a lot of Russian direct aid, and it also would have involved a lot more trade between Russia and Ukraine. And that, at this point at least, is sealed off. And the big benefit of what they were supposed to do, what this coup was about, was to sign an association agreement with the EU. And that's not going to happen either. So all of the people who, excuse me, and many of them were on the streets demonstrating because they genuinely wanted a better life, well, they've all been duped because their life is going to get much, much worse than it was before the coup. It'll be the worst of all worlds. No ties with its next-door neighbor, Russia. And the EU is not about to write a check for $30 or $40 billion. Are the Germans going to underwrite this huge albatross? Of course not.
No, they got to take care of the Greeks.
Yeah, and look how they've mismanaged that anyway. So they're capable of doing it.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, the average people suffer. They do get duped. They do go out into the street, a lot of them, because they think if we just overthrow this guy, we're going to all live like Germans and be very, very rich. But it doesn't happen that way. But they will suffer, just like the people in Egypt have suffered and other places where they've had revolutions have suffered. Yeah.
Well, it's all seems to be very messy. I think just one last question before we let you go, Daniel. Getting back to the Middle East, Russia had been sort of aligned with Syria. They can't be happy about the destruction then if all that's going on. Do you think this is part of what Putin was alluding to in his push for rules as opposed to a system, a new order without rules?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I think what Putin is upset about is the U.S. Purporting to fight radical jihadists, while at the same time having spent the last 3 or 4 years at least supporting those very same radical Islamists. And Russia has had more attacks by these Islamists on its soil, certainly, than America and Canada and all of these countries.
Sure.
Combined, so they do know Russia is very, very sensitive to the threat of jihadists in its country, but it doesn't understand why the U.S. continues to demand the ouster of Assad, why it continues to back this farcical Free Syrian Army, which doesn't exist. They're all, to whatever extent they're capable of fighting, they're doing it in coordination with ISIS and with Al Qaeda. So Russia doesn't understand how these two completely opposite things can be true at the same time. It doesn't. It's very Orwellian. It's doublespeak.
Yeah, well, it's doublespeak, all right, and it just seems to be, nothing makes sense here. It seems to me that what we've got is an out-of-control parasitic system that just wants to have war, and it doesn't. Whatever it can do to stimulate more war, that seems to be the military-industrial complex's modus operandi, I guess.
And slowly but surely, the de-dollarization of the world continues.
Yeah.
Watch the renminbi. You watch the. You're seeing this as your listeners are very well aware. This is the process that's continuing, and I think it's unstoppable now.
Well, it's we can just hope and pray that somehow some divine intervention perhaps stops this mess, because it is really seemingly to me getting out of control, and it seems to me that Putin was really sort of warning us that we better watch what we're doing, because if we keep encroaching and taking away and stirring up trouble and creating chaos around the world, it's going to be a much worse place to be alive. And so anyway, on that not so happy note, I want to thank you again, Daniel, for spending time with us and giving us an update on all of these very important issues.
Thank you very much, Jay.